I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. We're talking A Christmas Carol. Hit it. It was 1984. The Soviet Union boycotted the LA Olympic Games. English pound notes were taken out of circulation. Michael Douglas romanced the stone, and George C. Scott was visited by 4 ghosts to help him change his ways. I'm your host, Jerry D, with another episode of Totally Rad Christmas, the podcast that talks all things Christmas in the 80s. Toys, movies, specials, music, and fads. If it was gnarly during Christmas in the 80s, we got it covered. Joining me is a very special guest. You'll know him as the host of the legendary Christmas Past podcast. It's Brian Earl. Brian, how's it going?
Hi, very well. Thanks for having me on, Jerry.
Yeah, well, thanks for coming on. I've been wanting to get you on for quite a while, and of course, things get busy and all that. So I'm glad you finally could do it. Yeah.
Yeah, happy it all worked out.
Yeah, definitely. And I hope you don't mind me saying legendary or things like that, but you're kind of...
I don't mind that at all. In fact, if you want to say it again, I would not be
Okay. Yeah, you're like the godfather of Christmas podcasts. So
it is funny. When I launched Christmas Past in 2016, there were, I didn't count, but under a dozen other Christmas podcasts. I think the one that really helped me to understand that an ordinary guy like me could create a Christmas podcast in a closet in his place in San Mateo, California, was a great podcast that's no longer around. It's The Christmas Stocking by Lee Cameron.
Yeah.
And then all the other Christmas podcasts it would be like a church would release their Christmas sermon as a podcast feed, or a couple of those internet radio stations would release a playlist of Christmas songs.
Right.
There were really very, very few. And so I think when Christmas Past started in 2016, it was just one of a small handful. And then it was 2018 that it just really took off. That's where we saw the likes of Deck the Hallmark. I think 'Tis the Podcast came around that time too. And of course, as you know, every year it just keeps growing and growing and growing. So yeah.
Oh, I know. Yeah, it seems like every day there's another Christmas podcast I got to add to my little list of folks that are getting on.
I was doing my very best last year to keep up with it all. I created a directory. It's still on my site, the definitive directory of Christmas podcasts. But of course, it's no longer definitive. It's a good problem to have when there are more Christmas podcasts than you can possibly keep up with. But discoverability in general is a big issue for podcasts, and Christmas ones especially. So I say if you type Christmas into your favorite podcast app, you'll find a handful of Christmas podcasts, but then it'll also be the Christmas episode of some other podcast that has nothing to do with Christmas, or just an episode of something like, I don't know, just some regular podcast that happens to mention Christmas. So I was doing my best to try to help get more Christmas podcasts discoverable. But even it very quickly became something that was almost impossible to do.
I understand. Yeah, it seems so. There's that Christmas podcasts podcast, which is the very meta one by Sean, where he just kind of puts them all together. And that one, it seems like they're adding some every day as well. So it's just, I'm trying my best to keep up, and same thing, just spread some more Christmas cheer. So thanks again for coming on and helping us small guys come out. So I really appreciate that. But we're actually here to talk about the 1984 made-for-TV movie released in Britain theatrically, A Christmas Carol. This version was one that I remember seeing, but I didn't remember a lot of specifics about it. I just had vague recollections, and when I'd see a still from it, it was one of those where you'd kind of point at the screen and say, "Oh yeah, I know what that is," and that's really about it. But what's your experience with the Christmas Carol in general, and then this particular version?
I think with A Christmas Carol in general, like most people in general, but certainly most people my age, my first experience with it would have been a cartoon version, probably Mickey's Christmas Carol. I think I had a book with a cassette tape that narrated this, with one of those, when you hear the chimes ring, it's time to turn the page, one of those kinds of things.
Yes.
And then later on, I found on eBay a one with a 45 record. And so, like Goofy is Jacob Marley, Jiminy Cricket plays, what is he, the Ghost of Christmas Present or Ghost of Christmas Past. And then I think some of my experiences after that would have been other cartoon versions, which honestly I can't remember which ones I've seen. There are so many. Some of them were just one-off generic ones. There's one from 1971, so before my time, but I certainly saw it growing up. That was, and I believe it had Alistair Sim voicing the character of Ebenezer Scrooge. I could be wrong about that. But what I remember most about this one, and it's available on YouTube, is that the ghosts were very, very cool looking. Nice. The Ghost of Christmas Past especially seems to have like 3 or 4 faces that are moving and morphing as she talks. And it's surprising that they would make that a children's cartoon because it's almost spooky, but to an adult it's like, wow, that's kind of cool and edgy looking for a 70s children's cartoon.
And sorry to interrupt, but that's actually how the Ghost of Christmas Past is described in the novella. That you can tell if he was old or young. Sometimes he had 8 arms, sometimes he had, just like continuous morphine features. So that's really cool. Yeah, that's
a very, very cool visual.
Yeah.
And so I think that was most of my experience, the children's versions of it, various cartoon versions of it. And I was born in 74. So by the time this one came out in 84, I was 10 years old. And I honestly don't remember watching it as a child. Right. My first memory of it, if I search really deeply, is probably more in my teens or something, maybe in the early 90s, perhaps. So it's just a few years old at that time.
Right.
And I never read the novella start to finish until I was maybe in my mid to late 20s.
That's actually very similar to myself as well. It wasn't until I was in college that I actually sat down and read it, and I really enjoyed it. It's everything that you want it to be after watching all the different versions. Because like you, I also was introduced to it through Mickey's Christmas Carol. I think it was the same thing. I did also have the book, same as well. I think mine was on tape though. I don't think it was on record. I think it was a tape version of it. But it was the same thing. As soon as it, like you said, when you hear the chimes, turn the page. It was exactly. Although I believe at that point, the version that I had, I think it had the Wicked Queen in her witch form as the Ghost of Christmas Future.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it was a little bit different. I think Merlin was the Ghost of Christmas Past as well, instead of Jiminy Cricket, and then that was changed for the theatrical release of that. But same thing. That's how I grew up with it, and I remember watching Rankin Bass's "The Stingiest Man in Town" as well. They'd show that, which Walter Matthau as Scrooge is amazing. But that was my experience with it. Eventually, I saw other versions, the Alistair Sim, the very popular one, and then Scrooged as well, but with Bill Murray, which I think that one and Muppet Christmas Carol are probably my favorite theatrical versions. This one, again, I don't really recall. Just like you, I don't have very strong memories of, but I just have visions, like the Marley, this particular version of Marley, for some reason always stood out to me. And I don't know if it's because he was just a little bit more portly than some of the other versions, or his manner of walking. Something about him just always stuck out to me. So I remember Marley, and I remember the Ghost of Christmas Present as well, with his green robe and the beard. And which of course Ghost of Christmas Present I think is my favorite ghost out of all of the spirits. But it was just something very memorable, but nothing very definitive. And if you had asked me who played what, I couldn't tell you at the time. It was just, I remember that guy was in that thing and he did it. So that's kind of my experience with it as well. And in college, I did reading the novella, and now it's one of those where I have to read it every single year. It's just like a tradition to me to sit down every Christmas tide if I can. And, it's not a very long read. It takes, no time at all really to get through the whole thing. But
yeah, I think it's only 50,000 words or something like that.
Something like that. Yeah. It's really small.
And, it's the same experience like bringing any book to the screen. You're necessarily leaving out a lot of the, the descriptions and things like that. It all has to be visual. And so the first time you read it, you pick up on a lot of the, just even the whole Marley was dead to begin with, and then going into like, well, I guess a doornail could be dead. Like you don't get those in the movie. There's a lot of kind of wit and witticism going on from the narrator of the story that never translates to the screen.
Yes.
And even one of my favorite theatrical readings of the story is one that Sir Patrick Stewart did, where it's available on a CD. I think you can probably find it on the internet, where he does this one-man production of it. And I think it's condensed down to an hour or so or something like that. And then comparing that to the actual movie version that he did, I think it was about 10 years ago, which I was not a fan of at all, I have to say. The reading, I feel like, is much, much better.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Patrick Stewart, I thought he did a fine job in that one as well, but production wise, it didn't seem like it was up to snuff compared to some of the other versions that were out there. I have heard his audio version, and I agree, it's remarkable. There's one that I wouldn't have guessed would be as good as it was, and that was by Jonathan Winters, who has an audio version of it, and he does the same thing. He plays all the characters, and that one was pretty good as well.
It was also a Rich Little one where that was a
oh yeah,
it was sometime in the 80s, a television special where he plays all the characters.
He plays all, yes, of course, Rich Little. Yes, that was, it's on my to-do list. I'll get to it eventually, but I have a lot of other things I want to get to before it, like Coca-Cola. I want to talk about that in particular, and stuff like that. So I try to space out my movie and shows if I can with some other fun stuff as well, like toys and fashion and stuff like that. So that's on my to-do list. Eventually I get to Rich Little's version, but and Henry Winkler's version as well of An American Christmas Carol.
Yeah.
But
I think I'm with you that the Muppet Christmas Carol is certainly one of my favorite, and I think it's partly because it's so surprisingly close to the story. You thought it would just be like really Muppety, and of course it is to a certain extent, but the production value is just insanely good.
Yes.
And it tells the story. You're like, okay. I wouldn't have imagined it could be as earnest as it was, but it was.
And I think I read somewhere that about 90% of Gonzo's dialogue was taken straight from Dickens' novels. And
oh, is that right?
Yeah,
that makes sense.
So that's really nice because he's supposed to be Charles Dickens, and he's supposed to be the omniscient narrator. The part that you're right, and you're right, when you read the novel or the novella, excuse me, and you're going through it, there are a lot of little things that you miss. And so, as you mentioned, that whole part about the dead as a doornail, I like how he kind of digresses into you think a coffin nail would be the deadest piece of ironmongery around, and so I like that that little touches that he throws in that you just, like you mentioned, you just kind of miss that when you get to see it on screen, and a lot of that is just because you have to condense, unfortunately.
And you miss out on a lot of great descriptions, especially if you're interested in what Christmas may have been like for an average family back in Victorian times. He goes into elaborate detail on what preparing the Christmas dinner was like, especially Mrs. Cratchit making the Christmas pudding. And how it smells like a laundry room in their house because they have to cook it in a cloth. And all of the stuff about putting the pudding into the copper pot where you have to put it on top of an upturned plate underneath to keep it from burning.
Right.
And so as the water's boiling, you hear the plate rattling around. There's all these very sensory information. You hear like what it might smell like and look like. And of course, in any movie version, the best you're going to get is just seeing a Christmas pudding put on the table. Right. So yeah, like you said, it's not a long read. It's well worth anyone who really, really wants to get the full experience. You can't get it through a movie at all. And you can only get it through either a reading or a full narration.
Yes, I completely agree. One of these days I do want to actually attempt to make a Christmas pudding. I've never tried. I'm a little bit nervous about it because I know it's, if you don't get that steam just right, it doesn't really work. So I'm a little nervous, but I do want to try one of these days.
Well, I tried it last year, and so I can give you some advice. I tried to make the traditional Eliza Acton's Christmas pudding.
Okay.
This was, and in her cookbook, she called it the author's Christmas pudding. And people wonder whether she is the author or if she's referring to Charles Dickens, because she's the first person to refer to this thing as a Christmas pudding. Like a lot of our Christmas foods are, it would be common to eat rich and fancy foods around Christmas, but they weren't necessarily associated tightly with Christmas, like fruitcake or eggnog were typically just kinds of things you would drink or consume at just the special times, and only later they become specifically Christmas. And the same is true for puddings. Those were just things that you would eat when it was some sort of a celebration. But Eliza Acton in her cookbook, and it was published, I forget when, but it was shortly after A Christmas Carol, where she's referring to it as a Christmas pudding. And it was after that this became a pretty much exclusively Christmas kind of food. But anyway, so I tried to recreate her recipe, which includes a lot of alcohol. And so, around Christmas time, everyone knows a fruit cake with a little bit of liquor on it gives it that special taste. But like moderation is definitely the key there. Just a little bit to get the flavor. Where in hers, you actually add a bunch of liquor to the cake.
Okay.
And in her recipe, it just says add a small wine glass full. And it's like, what does that mean? So I did a little bit of extra research and found out on YouTube that they were saying it's something, some, I don't know, about 3 or 4 ounces worth. And it came out okay, but it just tasted so boozy. It was overpowering.
Gotcha.
And I don't know if, back in the day, you basically had to add booze to everything to kill off any germs.
Right, to keep it, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Or if people just happened to like that extra boozy kick, or if I just made it wrong, I don't know. But it just tasted overpoweringly boozy.
So talking about the Christmas pudding, and correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't that usually done on like Stir Up Sunday?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think that came later on once it was associated.
It was already associated.
With Christmas.
Right.
Yeah. Then after that, it was Stir Up Sunday is, I believe, the first Sunday of Advent or something like that.
So it's the Sunday before. It's the last Sunday before.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the 24th and final Sunday after Pentecost. Although there are 3 other Sundays in Advent. Actually, the prayers actually do start with Stir Up as well. So it could be, it could be associated with any of those other 3 Sundays. But traditionally, it was the final Sunday of Pentecost. But yeah, so I want to try it. I don't know where to get currants around here. I'm sure there's some specialty stores I can find some.
I get some off Amazon. The thing you're going to have a really hard time with is finding beef suet. You cannot find that in the United States. You have to order it, and it took about a month for mine to show up. But the thing is, like, you'll find, those were just, currants they're basically small raisins. Like you can use raisins, and if you don't want to use beef suet, use butter, use shortening. What I found, because I actually tried making it twice last season, is it's very forgiving recipe. If you just throw a bunch of stuff that's pretty accurate according to the recipe and boil, steam it for 3, 4, 5 hours, it doesn't matter all that much. It's going to come out tasting fine.
Okay, cool. And you just have to get the good seal on it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Definitely do that. And then this season, I haven't tried making one yet. I'm going to try a different recipe because I don't want that boozy flavor. But what I do want to do is then douse it with booze and light it on fire. I didn't get to do that last season, but I'd really love to do that.
That's the fun part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I can imagine what it would take in 1843, I guess is when it was released. So it should be around there. I can only imagine what they would have to do to really get that tight seal and steam it and just really get it to be good. I don't know how in depth or how precise their equipment was.
I'm guessing
at that time.
Not very at all, especially because, as you know from reading the novella, the description of the Cratchit's kitchen is also one where, nowadays every kitchen has an oven. That wasn't true back then.
Right.
She had to send the goose out to the cook, the bakery to cook the goose. So in the house, they would basically have the washing copper where they did laundry, or some fire where they basically have like a pot that could just sit over fire. There are no you don't set the temperature high or low. It's just there's a fire. And what they would do is wrap up the pudding mixture in cheesecloth and form a cannonball, because I'm assuming someone like that probably wouldn't have a fancy or ornate pudding mold. And so, my thinking was that whatever they could come up with, like as long as it held together and tasted okay, would be a pretty special treat.
Gotcha. Now, in this particular version, we get George C. Scott, who I mostly knew from Patton, as Scrooge. He plays Scrooge. His take is definitely different. He's not so much miserly as he is just like a very strict businessman, I think.
Yeah, he's definitely. Most of my other experiences with the story is that Scrooge is not only miserly but just cranky. He's if you look at him, he'll scowl at you. And yeah, you're right. I think this portrayal is much more businesslike and maybe a bit more like introverted. Not necessarily actively shooing people away, but just sort of like have no interest in people. That was the sense I got from him. Because in a lot of conversations that you see him having, he seems personable enough. He seems like there's enough of a conscience to him,
right?
And I think that really lends to the redemption at the end being a little bit more believable. But he doesn't have that same, like don't even look at him when he's walking down the street kind of feel. Just someone who's just too wrapped up in his own stuff to want to deal with other people. That's really the way that I feel like he portrayed the character.
Which I tell you, like I mentioned earlier, I work in a Christmas store. Some days I really feel that. I love working with people. I love talking to people, but there are certain days where after working 10 days straight, I'm ready to take a break,
Yeah.
and it's like, let me just go in the back. I'll put some lights and some wreaths and just leave me
Hmm.
alone and let me do my thing. Unfortunately, I can't because I'm kind of like an assistant manager. But yeah, I get where Scrooge is coming from in this one a lot.
Yeah. And actually, there's a story that came out a few years ago called Marley by an author named John Clinch. And it's the backstory of Jacob Marley. Really good book. I had John Clinch on my podcast. It's not a Christmas story at all. It really
Okay.
follows Marley. But, Scrooge and Fan is actually a fairly major character, Scrooge's
Oh wow.
sister.
His sister, yeah.
Um, but when I was talking to him, I said, there's something about the way that you portray Scrooge that he almost might have seemed like he was on the autism spectrum. And he's like, I'm glad you picked up on that. That's exactly where I was coming from, where he's just one of these people who can only see things, very analytically and wouldn't make eye contact with people and was antisocial to the point where he couldn't connect. And that seemed like a really interesting way to portray Scrooge. I mean, obviously not authentic at all. I mean, Dickens was doing something very specific in portraying Scrooge as a capitalist who couldn't see the humanity of all the great poverty in London at that time.
Right.
So, it's taking it out of that context. But I think it also modernizes the story, and people can bring a modern sensibility to their understanding of Scrooge. So, I think most people watching any of those specials isn't really looking at it through the lens of like Dickensian history. It just needs to be first and foremost a piece of entertainment. And so I think the way that George C. Scott portrayed Scrooge certainly achieved that.
Well, he was very shrewd. I mean, in his dealings with those gentlemen, the other businessmen there at the station, and I guess he had some corn or some feed or something he was trying to sell them, and they didn't want it at a particular price, and so he basically said, okay, that's it. And so then they, he raised the price on them, and I mean, just they're back and forth, and the way he dealt with it actually kind of reminds me of a lot of businessmen that I've worked with, where it's like, okay, well, that was my offer back then. Now my offer is just this, take it or leave it. And they're able to build their wealth and go, be successful from there. So I really enjoyed that kind of portrayal from him, because you don't see that a lot. You basically see all right, well, you can't pay foreclosed, that kind of just who cares, just stingy, I just want my money kind of guy. And so this actually made Scrooge rather unique in my mind, because he's more savvy around with money, not just, if you can't pay me, too bad. So I really enjoyed George C. Scott's portrayal of him as well. And that whole, on the autism spectrum, that's actually kind of nice because that, at least in my mind, I can see how that could sour his relationship with Belle a little bit, and the difficulties, where you're focused on one thing so much that you kind of neglect other things. So that's a really interesting concept.
Yeah, great book. I recommend it to everybody. But I always say that Scrooge is in it, Fan is in it. There are some Christmas scenes, but it is absolutely not a Christmas story at all.
Okay. Well, that's all right. I don't mind. I like other stories. We get a few other actors in here of note. Just David Warner was in it. Roger Rees. I know Roger Rees from a lot of the 80s movies that I was into as well. So just a few actors here and there. No one really super famous. I mean, I think George C. Scott was the most famous of everyone in this, but I thought they all did fine jobs, acting their parts. They were very serviceable in their roles. Nothing too memorable, unfortunately, but at the same time, I thought they did well.
Yeah, no, I can't really think of any other standout performances. Maybe whoever played Fezziwig. I think that's the scene when I think of the movie. That's the one that always comes to mind. I don't know if it's just because it's the most festive and all the dancing or something like that. The other scene, and you tell me, you've probably read this closer than I have, that I always remember is when Cratchit is saying it's too cold in the office, and Scrooge is like, "Look at me! Like, what is this? What am I wearing?" He's like,
yeah.
That's a vest. What am I wearing? What is this? That's a jacket. He's like, see, is that in the book?
I don't recall that particular line, that piece of dialogue, because there's a few things that they threw in that aren't in the book, like the whole exchange with his actual father, appearing.
Yeah.
So that was definitely different. I don't recall that from the book, honestly. I don't. But he said it very sarcastically.
Right.
Which again kind of made me like Scrooge a little bit more for some reason. Maybe because I like that misanthrope character, archetype, like House, Hugh Laurie's House from how I attracted to for some reason that I just enjoy that particular character trope. So when he was kind of sarcastic, like, well, you see this thing? It's called a jacket. I mean,
right.
It not only made me laugh, but it made me like Scrooge a little bit more. He does have a sense of humor. He is, like you said, a little bit. He has personality. He has character, and so I think it's better than just that strict miser portrayal that you get most of the time.
But I think that line was also a really clear power play, right? The whole, like, because he knew that Cratchit couldn't afford all of those,
one.
But then also making him answer these obvious questions that, are just plain to see, but still having to go through the process of saying, yeah, that's a coat, that's a waistcoat, like that whole thing really, I think it was, if it was added, if it wasn't in the book, it was meant to show his sort of, need to dominate or humiliate Cratchit. But I will say the things that humanize him or make him a little bit more likable is the way that he delivers that line that everyone who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be buried with a stake of holly through his heart. The way that he delivers that line is unlike any other actor I've ever seen, where he's actually like laughing, like he thinks it's a funny joke. Whereas if you watch like an Alistair Sim or Patrick Stewart portrayal, that they're saying it with a sneer and not with a laugh.
Yeah, there's more venom to it.
Yeah. And I think that's, other than his redemption in this version, that's the only other time you see him laughing.
Right. One thing that I did notice about this particular version as well is that whenever, in most versions, you can already see Scrooge's facade start to kind of come down, and some of those walls just be penetrated when usually right after the first ghost has appeared, but always, especially after the second ghost. In this particular one, it didn't seem like it really hit him until he finally saw that the grave of his own mortality and all that stuff. So it really wasn't until the third ghost that it really got him. Whereas I think in most versions, he's already starting to change his heart after at least the second ghost.
Yeah, I think there are maybe some more subtle hints where I think with Christmas Present, when he sees the Cratchit family Christmas, he seems to, he's like, well, that's a pretty small bird. Like, he doesn't seem to either care or not care, but the fact that he would note it. But then I think you're right that I think any sort of hint that he might be starting to see the light, he kind of shakes it off really quickly.
Yes.
Right? Like, he wants to just kind of stay the way that he is.
I did like, and again, I know we're jumping around, but everybody knows A Christmas Carol. I don't think we really have to get too deeply into the story itself. I did like his whole exchange with Fred on Christmas morning when he's apologizing to him. And, I came here to say three things and to do three things. And one of them was to meet your lovely wife, to ask your forgiveness, that whole bit. I enjoyed that bit because we normally don't see that Christmas morning with Fred. In fact, in a lot of versions, we kind of get him with Cratchit, and that's about it. That's how they tend to end. So that whole interaction and seeing him finally embrace, his sister's son, I that really gave me, as they say, all the Christmas feels.
Yeah, and I think it was a nice little ribbon to put on the end of that.
Yeah, definitely. Of course, Joanne Whaley played his niece, Fred's wife there. I know her mostly from Willow. She played opposite Val Kilmer in that movie Willow with...
Oh, wow. I remember that was another 80s movie. Was that before or after this came out?
It was after. I think it was like 87 or 88, something like that.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah, so so that's what I mostly remember her from. And then she was in like a weird oddball movie with Bill Murray called The Man Who Knew Too Little. It was a take on...
Oh, I remember that. Yeah.
I
don't know if I saw that, but I remember knowing about it.
Yeah, it's just a little fun, you turn your brain off and enjoy the pseudo spyness of it all. But so that's where I knew her from. David Warner, who played Bob Cratchit, I remember him most from Tron. He was the villain in Tron.
Okay, we're bringing back all the 80s movies. Now I'm
well,
taking a little trip down memory lane.
That's my thing.
That was another thing. Like, I had seen Tron probably without being aware of it. Like either there was a
Mm-hmm.
drive-in near where I grew up where it had two screens. And oftentimes we go to the drive-in, but then we'd look at the other screen and kind of like watch a movie without really like hearing the movie. And
Right.
Tron might be an example of that. And then I didn't actually watch it start to finish until I was much, much older, like maybe in my late 20s or something.
Well, I think he was also in Time Bandits as well, and a
Oh
few
yeah.
Star Trek here and there. Yeah, that's mostly where I know him. He's kind of sci-fi, although he's done a lot of other work. But I thought again his portrayal of Bob Cratchit was very, very serviceable and good. It just nothing stood out to me in particular, but I did like the way he kind of tried to make excuses, to his wife about, like it's the day, it's Christmas Day, which is another bit in the book that we don't really see translated very well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I feel like we don't really get a sense of what their household might have been like. There's usually in the storybooks I grew up with, it shows the Cratchits as being like fairly middle class. Their houses seems to be like big enough. And in the book, obviously, the description is very, very different.
Yes.
And in the book, you don't really meet the other children, but you kind of get more. There's who are the daughters? Belinda is one of his daughters.
Yes, and was it? No, I'm thinking of the Muppet Christmas Carol, Bettina.
There's two daughters and one other son, other than Tiny
Peter,
Tim.
right?
Peter, yeah. And in the book, like I don't know if they have a lot of dialogue or action, but you hear about them a lot more. Mm-hmm. You get a sense of the size of the household, and I feel like in this movie and others, they're kind of on the sidelines. Mm-hmm. But I mean, and the reason that's significant, I think, is when you see their feast. You always hear about it's a meager feast, but they all seem to be sitting like around a table, and their house has enough furniture in it. And there was that one scene in the movie where they're all sitting around the fire, right? They're sewing, and the mother says, "Oh yeah."
Oh, sorry.
No, that was my only point there.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, so special effects wise, of course, they did their best. I know the tombstone from that graveyard scene is still there in Shrewsbury, where it was filmed. Yeah,
it's interesting.
So you can still go visit it and take pictures with it and all that as well. I thought it was kind of cool that this whole thing was released theatrically in the UK. I mean, I could definitely see it being released theatrically. If they had increased the budget by a few million, I think they would have. They could have done it here in the US, but they instead just decided to go straight to TV, which a lot of times straight to TV movies. So I'm thinking in particular of the Night They Saved Christmas, one that I just recently did with Art Carney. They do their best with what they can, but oftentimes you're stuck with some mediocre effects. I thought in general this again they made use of their budget as best they could, and I thought they handled them very well. They weren't awful like I've seen some made for TV movies. So I don't know if it was just because the source material has that particular I should say it this way, because the source material doesn't really have a lot that needs to be done special effects wise. I think they're able to make it stretch their budget a little bit more, and so the effects that they do are pretty well.
What I remember most about it is more the kind of dark, moody feel that they give London in it, or kind of it's a little foggy and dirty looking,
which feels authentic to me.
And I feel like if you capture that mood, I can forgive bad special effects, or I'd rather see no special effects at all rather than really bad ones. And as a matter of fact,
I agree.
Go back to the Patrick Stewart version of A Christmas Carol. I feel like the effects in that are just a little. They don't fit. They feel like another team came in and decided what those should be like, and it just really feel like it didn't go together. I
definitely see where you're going with, and I think if you had transplanted Patrick Stewart into this movie, I think, and George C. Scott does a phenomenal job. I like the way he does it. The cast, they seem to have an energy and a synergy that really works. But I think if you had transplanted Patrick Stewart into this version, I think it would have been, better because he's Patrick Stewart.
Yeah.
But I did want to talk about the music. Nick Bicot did the music, and he wrote he actually wrote a little hymn to go with this, and that's what the main theme is based off of. It's called "God Bless Us, Everyone," and it's a nice, it's just a nice little lilting tune. But the cool thing that I like about it is that it transitions from 6/8 to 4/4 quite seamlessly. I don't know if you noticed that there. So again, it's pretty standard. There's just a lot of 2/5 chords in there. It's in the key of F, but the lyrics really got me. So I just want to read a little bit of lyrics here. It says, the past of man was cold as ice. He would not mend his ways. He strove for silver in his heart and gold in all his days. His reason weak, his anger sharp, and sorrow all his pay. He went to church but once a year, and that was Christmas Day. So, he kind of paints a nice little picture. But then he goes on to say, so grant us all a change of heart. Rejoice for Mary's son. Pray peace on earth to all mankind. God bless us, everyone. And that's when he transitions back to 6/8. So it starts in 6/8, moves to 4. So everything's very much, straight eighths. And then it goes back to 6/8. And so I kind of, you get that dichotomy of between lilting and just straight. And I think it really plays here because that more lilting is a lot more joyful because you have those triplets, 1, 2, 3, da, da, da. And so it kind of reflects, like Scrooge's innocence, and then it's very stern, and then all of a sudden it's back to that joyful feel. So I thought that was a nice touch that you don't really see in a lot of theme songs nowadays.
Yeah. And I was actually researching the music for this because I was hoping that I could find something similar for an episode that I'm working on for this season of Christmas Past. And I never would have thought that there, a soundtrack to it. I mean, of course, every movie has a soundtrack, but one that would be released and you could find on Spotify and just listen to. So I was actually spending some time with the soundtrack a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Well, so again, it's pretty standard. So in the key of F, he stays on the 1 chord for a long time. Then he goes to just regular progression, 6, then 4, 5, 1. There's, as I mentioned, there's a lot of 4, 5, that kind of thing. 2, 5, 1s all over the place, which is another really standard progression. I mean, I see your guitar in the background, so I assume
Well, 2, 5, 1's a standard. That's your jazz progression, right? Or no? Or am I thinking of what's the most common jazz progression?
2, 5, 1.
Is 2, 5, 1? Okay.
Yeah, it is, but 2/5s in general are just very popular because of the circle of fifths, and 4, 5, 1 is another one for substituting for the 2 chord there. So we get, but on that part, it's so grant us all a change of heart, rejoice for Mary's son. So just nice and lilting, da 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 da. And I really, I mean, just hearing that every time, it makes me just, I'm so full of joy because really it's so fun and upbeat and up tempo. And so I thought Nick Bicot did a great job with that.
Yeah, it's funny, the Christmas songs that aren't radio songs that become favorites, and just another example of that is in the Disney Christmas Carol. I don't know if you have in the tape, the audio version, there's an original Disney song, and it has nothing to do with Scrooge. It's just, I forget the name of it. It's called something like A Very Merry Christmas.
Oh, what a Merry Christmas Day or something like that.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Yeah.
And it has a very Disney feel. You can almost,
it does, yeah.
If the next song were It's a Small World After All, you'd say, okay, yeah, these songs kind of go together. But the only place you can hear it is on this recorded book version. And I listen to it every year. It's one of my favorite Christmas songs. But yeah, it's funny how some of Christmas favorite songs come from unexpected places like that.
And I actually have a version that I think the Air Force, like one of the Air Force choirs, actually recorded.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I have that on a playlist that I put that I play for my 3-year-old when she's trying to go to bed. So she really likes that version. But you're right. There's a lot of just different versions that are not standard. I think in this particular hymn that he wrote for this, or theme song, or whatever you want to call it, I think he kind of modeled it after Here We Come a Wassailing, because that's another one that goes between 6, 6/8 and 2/4, or 6/8 and 4/4. So while they're not very common, I'm glad he fixated on that because it just added a little bit of depth to it because it wasn't so common, at least in my mind. So yes, good job. You can go to his website. You can download the sheet music. You can also download the entire soundtrack if you'd prefer. And so that Nick Bicot is the composer there. But it does make me wonder that what would you say would be your happiest moment or memory of this particular version here? or just A Christmas Carol in general?
Yeah, I think from this one, I think I already touched on it, the scene at Fezziwig's, which I can't really say why it stands out. It just other than the obvious, where it seems very, very festive. And then I like the way that the redemption scene where he wakes up and he's happy. I mean, if you compare that to the way that other actors have done that, like where Alistair Sim does a headstand, and
Yes.
Patrick Stewart, there's one of the stranger creative choices I've seen him make, where it almost sounds like he's like vomiting the laugh, where comes from literally he's like and then he starts laughing, where it seems like it's coming from his from his feet out his mouth. Where this one, it just seems like he's just like uncontrollably giggly, where he just kind of can't contain his joy, and he's just like shouting out the window. So I think, yeah, and like you were saying, he doesn't seem to make this progressive change throughout the movie. It's really toward the end. I think maybe I see it a little bit differently. I start to see some glimmers of it,
Right.
and then when it finally comes to being, it has this pretty cathartic feeling where he's just so giddy he can barely contain himself, and he's just sort of like running around the room. I think of all the actors I've seen portray that moment, this is probably my favorite. And it's I mean, obviously the happiest of the story, because it's when he's happiest. So
Yes.
yeah, it really, that's a standout scene for me.
Yeah, for me, and that's a great one. For me, it's definitely there where he's at Fred's house the next day, and he's just apologizing, and he wants to be included and join in the games and have a wonderful dinner. And my mind just furnishes all the rest of the day, and him spending the day with Fred playing the games, and I can just imagine and go on that journey. And I think it's incredible that he can be so gruff the day before, and then all of a sudden just embrace that. And I know that whole transformation is what the story's about, but at the same time, I like the way it's played here, because we don't often get to see it. And so I think as a viewer, I'm able to just picture the rest of the story a little bit more. And so I appreciate that touch. That's a touch that is not really thrown in very often. So, so I definitely can appreciate it. But now we come to my favorite part of the show, which is a little segment I like to call Gag Me with a Spoon. So this is where we do our best impression of our least favorite part of the episode, and just kind of set up the scene for us, and then give it your best shot.
So this is the least favorite part of the movie. And
right.
I'm trying to...
I think I said episode, sorry.
My least favorite is going to be really hard to portray, because there's no dialogue. And this so you'll just have to cast your mind to his time with the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come, where when he opens his robes and you see the two famished children. And the reason it's both my favorite and my least favorite, because like I said, the sort of moodiness and smokiness of the movie, I really feel it comes into pretty sharp relief there. Where you see these emaciated children with like red circles under their eyes, and
very
all
gaunt,
that. Yeah, very, very gaunt. And I remember when I was really young, that was actually kind of spooky to me. And now I see it as a little bit more, I don't know, like punk feeling. It's
right,
a little more like moody and authentic. So whether it's I love it or hate it, it's certainly one that I tend to remember. It's one of like the maybe 5 scenes that if I play this movie in my mind, that's the one that comes about. But so I guess in terms of an impression, if you could just imagine me looking like I have hollow cheeks and circles under my eyes, we could do that. But also the sound that the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come makes, there's that sort of like, I don't know how you describe it, just like trumpets playing out of tune and echoing around whenever he moves his arm or something like that. I don't know if I can do an impression of that, but
that's okay. But no, that's okay. So I actually agree that the Ghost of Christmas Future is probably my least favorite part, and this is where Scrooge has been trying to ask him all sorts of questions, and he of course receives no answer from this the spectral figure here. And so Scrooge, and I'm going to do my best George C. Scott, so excuse me, but he goes, "You're devilishly hard to have a conversation with." So I don't know, that was my best. Yeah, I just thought the line was a little ridiculous, but for that moment, but it actually did kind of fit with Scrooge portrayal throughout this entire movie here. But yeah, it's just that as soon as I heard that line, I thought, okay, come on.
Is that in the novella?
I don't recall that
Yeah.
that particular line, so I'm gonna have to go back and read it now. I do wonder though. GI Joe, they taught us that knowing is half the battle. What do you think the other
Mm-hmm.
half of the battle is?
For Scrooge, let's see. Shop early, I guess, because when when Christmas finally comes around, I mean, and this is the other thing, like back in Victorian times, Christmas was not a day off necessarily.
Right.
And that's true, like even in the United States, until in some places, like well into the early 20th century, that schools and banks and everything would be open.
Mm-hmm.
So once he finally does come around, the only thing he buys is a goose or whatever it was that he bought the Cratchits. But then he has to go, he goes around to his family's house and all of that. And presumably now that he's in a good mood, he would want to have gifts to bear, but he never got around to doing any Christmas shopping.
Right.
So I think shopping early is always a good idea, no matter what time in history you find yourself.
Definitely. That's good advice for life, folks. Yeah, that's better than mine. I thought if knowing's half the battle, the other half is just doing whatever spectral visitors tell you if it's for your own good. So, oh man, Brian, it's been fun talking with you. But what do you want to plug? Tell me about your show.
Yeah, so Christmas Past has been around since 2016, and when it started, it actually started by mistake, where I was really into NPR style podcasts. And when Christmas season came around, this was, I think, 2015, I was like, I wonder if NPR has a Christmas podcast. And when it turns out they didn't, I said, I wonder what that would sound like. And like I said before, the only other Christmas podcast that even came close was Lee Cameron's The Christmas Stocking.
Mm-hmm.
And I reached out to him and I said, hey, I'm thinking of starting a podcast. And he was really nice to me and sort of helped me set things up. And after that, I vowed, if anyone wants to start a Christmas podcast and they come to me, I'll do everything I can to help them. And I've been doing that for 5 years now, hoping to, just get people up and running. It's just one of the most creatively fulfilling things that you can do is have your own Christmas podcast. But so, yeah, that was the start of the show. Wasn't, I want to start a podcast or I want to start a Christmas podcast. It was more like I was looking for something, and when it didn't exist, I was like, okay, well, I guess I'm gonna do that. And for the first couple of seasons, that was the idea, that I would put out about 12 episodes where I was telling the backstories to Christmas traditions, doing it in a way that was reminiscent of NPR style news pieces where I'd interview an expert, but then cut it up with clips and share Christmas memories. But after a couple of seasons, as the fan base was growing, I got the feedback that, hey, if you wanted to put out episodes outside of the Christmas season, we wouldn't be averse to that. And if you wanted to do other stuff too. And so I started doing, in addition to those core episodes, the backstories, I would also do things like, dramatic readings of forgotten Christmas fiction, just other kinds of off-cycle kinds of episodes. And so this season and last season especially, I've been putting out, I think it's like 4 or 5 episodes a week, which is a lot to keep up with when you have a 1-year-old child and a busy job and anything at all like a normal life. But that's what I've been doing. So this season I'm trying to think what some of the standouts are. A Charlie Brown Christmas, the story of Figgy Pudding, Chestnuts, made for TV Christmas romances, which are I always like those things where, because Christmas changes so much constantly, we're always in a period where some cultural phenomenon that's popular now might be the birth of a new Christmas tradition. And some are not, right? Like back in the 60s, all these aluminum trees, like, hey, is this here to stay or is this a fad? But there's always something like that. Like, is the ugly sweater here did we witness the birth of a Christmas tradition right in front of our eyes? Or is that going to be a fad too? Are the made-for-TV Christmas romance movies that are exploding right now, is this the equivalent of the music explosion from the 1940s and 50s? Or is this just another thing that's going to come and go, or it's here to stay, but it's not really culturally significant or relevant? So I kind of like to geek out on that, right? This is nice. The end goal of my show is this is basically, the NPR of Christmas podcasts. So I try to like analyze things like that in a way that uses a lot of storytelling and feels engaging enough, and a cross between a nerdy deep dive and a warm-hearted celebration. So that's cool. Christmas Past, and I've been at it for a while. No signs of slowing down yet. And as a matter of fact, I've over the years tried different things. So back in 2019, I did a true crime Christmas podcast. It's not a separate podcast; it's just a story that lives within the Christmas Past feed called My Dear Santa. That's the true story of John Gluck, who in the early 20th century started this campaign for getting children's letters to Santa Claus answered, but he was also a bit of a con man. Really interesting story. And I worked with an author named Alex Palmer on that. But I've also done live shows and conference appearances and things like that. And so this year I said, well, what's next? What is the next thing that I want to do? And I figured, well, I've been around long enough and built up enough of an audience that maybe I could convince a publisher to put out a book. And so I'm happy to say that all of that is in the works right now.
Cool.
So Christmas Past, the book, is coming in the fall of 2022 from Lions Press. And I hope it's not too early to say, but it is looking like we're going to be doing an audiobook too.
Nice.
Which, as a podcaster, that makes a heck of a lot of sense.
Yes.
But that's a whole separate thing, right? Like the audio book producers are separate publishers. So it's
right.
a whole
right.
other thing that you have to do. But there will be at least one kind of book, text and or audiobook, coming in the fall of 2022. And then who knows what's after that? I mean, I'm always looking 1 or 2 steps ahead at a time. I knew the book was, the next creative thing. And then after that, there will be some other next creative thing as I just keep trying to try out new things and grow and be creative and just bring my little brand of Christmas cheer to as many people as I can.
Right on. Well, you brought it to me. Yours was the first Christmas podcast that I knew about. And so I actually found the Christmas stocking after I found yours. So thank you for all that.
Yeah. And it's a shame. Lee Cameron, he was, he's a radio DJ. And so he was doing something similar in that he was doing the history behind Christmas traditions. He would usually play some kind of song, a Christmas song, and he was really good at connecting with his audience. I feel like that was the two things that I took from him were that, the way that he engaged with the audience, especially Christmas, even the largest Christmas podcast is still a small podcast, comparatively speaking.
Right.
And, you really want it to feel like a family celebration. You really want the listeners to feel like they're part of Christmas with you rather than, simply putting out content. So I really took that lesson from him, that like, that's how you make something that feels special. And also that a podcast episode can be like 15 minutes long, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Because the most popular podcasts are well over an hour long, or at least a half an hour. I was like, would people really listen to like a 12-minute episode? And yeah, apparently they do. And lots of them are willing to do that, especially for Christmas stuff. Like this is something that, might just last the ride to the store to do some Christmas shopping, or you can have it on while you're wrapping presents or something like that. So yeah.
Nice.
But yeah, I'm sad that he doesn't do the podcast anymore.
Yeah, I was kind of bummed about that. When I formed our little Twitter group, I made sure to include him because I heard he was kind of still active on Twitter a little bit. So I thought, hey, let's for sure, because I'm sure he has great info to share, and maybe might want to share some with us.
Yeah, I know that I've seen him a little bit active on Facebook. I know that he had a career change and he went back to grad school, and now he's doing some kind of teaching or something like that. And I know he's very, very busy with that for a while. And that might have been why he stopped back in, I think it was 2018 or 2019 that he stopped putting out new episodes. But also he had been doing it for 10 years and he has over 150 something episodes out. So, maybe, I'm not looking forward to this, but eventually there will be a time when Christmas Past comes to an end. The original goal was to take all of the familiar Christmas traditions and tell the stories behind them. And what I don't want to do is get to the point where I've done all of that, but then in an effort to just keep things going, then I'm doing stuff that no one cares about, or it's a real strain to try to make it feel relevant. Sooner or later I will have covered everything and then the show's going to be over. But I don't think we're not near that point anytime soon. I'll last at least 10 years and probably more than that.
Nice. And I know what you mean. Like my goal has always been just to make people feel like they did when they were a kid on Christmas morning and they rush to the tree and see the presents under the tree. So if I can do that in any tiny little way, I'll definitely keep doing it as long as I can. So
yeah.
But again, Brian, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun just chatting with you.
I had a blast. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, anytime. You're always welcome. And so I will end it by saying, so grant us all a change of heart, rejoice for Mary's son, pray peace on earth to all mankind. God bless us, everyone. And check us out on our social media pages, Facebook and Instagram at Totally Rad Christmas and Twitter at Rad Christmas. And if you're feeling like Scrooge on Christmas morning, leave us a review on iTunes. Not only does it help us reach more people, but you also get a free sticker. Now, don't forget to check out our merch shop on tpublic.com and our brand new website, courtesy of Tis the Podcast Elf, Tom Crow. Later, dudes.
Hi, I'm Mark.
And I'm Jess. And we're Hallmark and Jess. I feel like we're at a car dealership commercial.
We swear we won't talk like this during the podcast.
There's two things we love most in this world.
Hallmark movies and Lacey Chabert.
And we're breaking down all of your favorite Hallmark movies like...
A Very Merry Mix-Up.
Rocky Mountain Christmas.
And the All of My Heart series.
Tommy, please be my husband.
So tune in every Wednesday. Today!